Hey everybody, my name's Alan. On behalf of the crew, I'd like to welcome you to another edition of Bridging Heaven and Earth. You know, we've done a lot of shows, and each one of the shows basically has more or less the same theme. And the theme is dedicated to the oneness, consciousness. How can we experience the true consciousness of what it is to be a human being, what it is to have a physical body and be the infinite, be part of the infinite, however you would look at it. And then when I was just sitting here, you know, waiting for the opening video, the opening credits to roll, I was just thinking, what is the real question for each of us in this life? And the one that came to me tonight at this moment was, do we know the love? Do we know the true love? The true love where there is no separation. The true love where we know that every human being on this planet is our brother and sister, where every tree is made of the same essence, of the same energy that we are, that every dolphin and whale, that every part of this incredible creation is us, that the Father and I are one, the Goddess and I are one, and that I and everything are one. And to have that experience on a consistent basis, and to know that truth and move forward in this life and walk on this incredible planet Earth, having that experience. And so much of our lives is spent in seeing and not experiencing that, and seeing what seems like, or experiencing what seems like, the separation and the differences between us. And with so much trauma going on in the world, in our individual lives, all the time, whenever this show is being shown, I am sure that there is trauma. Well, maybe, as I said last time, maybe not. Maybe it'll be over in 6 months or a year. But if there is trauma, do we know the love for each of us? Each of us watching the show, not as a group, not as a family, not as a race, not a religion, not as a sexual preference, but each one of us individually, as pieces of God, of pieces of truth, no matter what our color, our race, our religion. Do we know the love, the true love? And if we don't, then that has to be the question we ask, and that has to be the hunger we seek to fulfill that hunger. Because in a human body, in a human life, we can know that love, that unconditional love, that we are all the same love, that we are the lights of the world, each of us, young, old, all the things that we think are separate, we are the lights of the world. So whenever anybody is watching this show, ask yourself that question: do you know the love? And if you don't, then maybe something needs to be rearranged in your life, maybe a certain priority. Do we need to stop and smell the love? Yes, we do. So again, that's what this show tonight is about, is how to smell the love, how to know the love. And our guest, Robert Sachs, is a gifted teacher and author. He teaches how to integrate contemporary scientific approaches with ancient wisdom traditions. He's the author of 5 extraordinary books. The new one is called The Passionate Buddha. He's written 9-Star Key, Tibetan Ayurveda, Rebirth Into Pure Land, and Perfect Endings. Robert was a guest on Bridging Heaven and Earth before, and we've gotten a tremendous response about his basically his peaceful passion, his knowing about that love. And throughout his whole life, that was the question in his life. How can I know that love more? Do I know that love? And then we have 2 videos that I think are some of the more extraordinary videos we've shown on Bridging Heaven and Earth. They're 2 Lessia music videos. Both of the songs I co-wrote with her, the question in Heaven and Earth. And I'll describe them, I'll set the stage for them when we're ready to come on with them. But so join me in a short meditation, then we'll have the question video, and then Robert will be with us. And it's a time to ask and answer the question, do we know the love? So please join me in a short meditation. If you don't know one, just relax, settle in, get comfortable, all right? Thank you very much. So we're going to begin tonight's show with a Lessia music video, The Question. This we did, it was done by the crew live as we were doing a live show. We did this on 9/14/2001, 3 days after 9/11, the World Trade Centers. You'll see, actually, I was on the set doing meditation during this whole piece. It's a 7-minute piece. I was wearing different clothes. It was the Carlos Reynosa images, and also there's an LA Times picture of a father and his 2 sons in the funeral of the wife and the mother. Now, this was an Israeli family, but it could have been a family anywhere. I mean, everywhere there's some level of hatred resulting in someone going to a funeral with their mother, their child, their wife, their husband, for reasons unbeknownst to the love. So, do we know the love? Okay, the question.
We can try too hard when it's easy. We can want too much we don't really need. We can save our laughter for tomorrow. We can trap ourselves when we're so very we might never dare. We can make ourselves so damn important. We can hide our hearts, pretend we don't care. Love is the question. Strive to win at any cost. We can play a part to please another. We can search for meaning till we're lost. Love is a question. Life is a journey. Love is the answer. Tomorrow we'll learn. We can choose to fight or choose to listen. We can give or grasp. It's always our call. Each moment we are given, 'cause the truth is that we have it all. Love is a question. Life is a journey.
welcome. We're on the set with Robert. Hi, Robert. Welcome
Hi,
back.
Alan. Oh, thank you.
You know, it's interesting. When I first got the book, Passionate Buddha, I thought it said Compassionate Buddha.
Oh, yes.
And so it's interesting. I mean, what would you say is like the difference between the Passionate Buddha and the Compassionate Buddha, or is there no difference?
There really,
besides the COM or something.
there really isn't any difference. What you're looking at, Alan, is the idea that when you look at enlightenment in its fullest sense, what it is it's totally engaged with life in all its forms, and therefore compassion is what radiates from it, but it is a passionate intensity with which enlightenment is represented. So although it sounded very strange when we were looking at it, we changed the title. Originally it was going to be Romantic Buddha, which would have really thrown everybody
Right.
off. But we went to Passionate, and I think it in many ways reflects what is described as the fullest sense of what enlightenment is.
Just joyous everywhere, and compassion everywhere.
Joy, and it's also about an intimacy that is unending, the sense that at the point of enlightenment, when you really realize in terms of oneness that there is no boundary. For the longest time, what we do in order to establish our sense of who we are is we work on boundaries, and we have boundary issues and all sorts of things. And the more you begin to discover about yourself and the more you begin to open up to who you are, suddenly there's a porousness which begins to make it so that that boundary that was so important to maintain no longer becomes essential. And therefore, even the idea is that when a being becomes enlightened, and you hear in New Age circles the idea, well, I'm not going to come back again. I'm just here, and then I'm off to a new realm. And from the standpoint of enlightenment, or the standpoint of Buddhahood, the idea is we never get away from each other. And therefore, the best thing you can do is, once you open up to it, is to engage it fully.
And do you think there, you used the word enlightenment a few times. I mean, is there a certain, in an arbitrary line, do you cross somewhere? I mean, what exactly would you define as enlightenment in that sense?
There are usually, they talk about 108 minor marks and 37 major marks of a Buddha, but essentially there are three properties, and this has to do with the three poisons that we overcome in our life. The three poisons that we have to overcome: one is ignorance, one is attachment, and one is aggression, and that's what all of us face. In essence, what it is that we don't know what's going on, we think we know what's going on, and we get irritated with anybody that tells us that we're wrong. And those poisons influence everything we do. And in the process of awakening to what's really behind those poisons, what we look at with the transformation of that ignorance is a recognition of our unlimited potential. So that's one aspect of Buddha nature. In terms of that attachment, what happens is we begin to realize that our mind is unlimited, and we actually open up to that unlimited mind. And the third has to do with that aggressiveness, which is that heat that we feel that is so consumed in on our own needs, which after it begins to open up to the connectedness of everything, becomes spontaneous and joyful. So that spontaneous joy, that unlimited mind, and that potential, recognition of our full potential, are really the marks of what enlightenment is when it's at its fullest.
Would you say that even defining enlightenment cannot be helpful in a way?
In some ways, yeah. I mean, I think what we're looking at is we all have to start where we are, and some of us are caught in whatever kinds of situations we get ourselves into. And if we really start sort of like dangling this kind of ultimate carrot in front of us, it can be a way in which we end up just flagellating ourselves for not being that, as opposed to what is essentially the only way to really get to that point is to essentially recognize where we are, where we're stuck, and begin to work on that. That's more important.
In an ever-expanding consciousness, is there ever a place where you're fully conscious?
Well, I hope so.
You think?
Well, that's what tradition teaches. And
I know, I'm asking you.
And
in your experience, because I mean, if something's ever expanding, it's like cutting, one in half, and you keep cutting it in half, and
well, you end up with this kind of infinitesimal or infinite mind, and I think that is it's got to be that way, because I think what happens is when you begin to open up, the sense of freshness and spaciousness expands, and then obviously what we do is we get caught up and settled. I mean, I think what we have our own moments of enlightenment. We have our own moments where we really connect with things, and then what we do is we fall asleep at the wheel again. And the goal of enlightenment is never to fall asleep at the wheel again.
Mm-hmm. And the passionate Buddha is more directed in how relationships can be a feeding experience for that, an opening experience.
Absolutely. What I wanted to do was in that sense of total engagement, which is what the tantric version or vision of enlightenment is, what I wanted to do was really look at issues of intimacy. And sure, there are the more, let us say, the more transcendental concepts of intimacy. But probably for most of us, the best testing ground for how we're doing in our lives is how we relate to each other, how we relate in our intimate relationships. So what I wanted to do was address relationships in general somewhat, but mostly focus on those kinds of heated, passionate relationships that we all seek out, which in fact is a way in which we are trying to connect with something that is deeper and bigger than ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Now, and there was a specific instance, I remember in the book, where you were walking with a friend who'd been involved in
He was a psychotherapist,
and involved in this stuff for 1,000 years, it seemed.
Right.
And he was still in a big pit with it, right? Why don't you tell that story a little bit?
Well, actually, what it was he was a psychotherapist, and he would counsel people. I mean, he was involved in transpersonal psychology and talking to people about relationships all the time. But again, it's one of those things that you can be knowledgeable of the techniques and mechanisms by which other people can transform their lives, and then you eventually have to turn yourself under the same microscope, and that's the scariest part. And that, I think, as you begin to do it. And what was nice about this particular person, he's a dear friend, is that he relentlessly is totally prepared to turning the microscope back on himself. But at this point when we had this conversation, he was looking out there in the world and wondering where it was at. And I was just
he was going through a dark and bitter divorce.
Very dark and bitter time. And to some extent, I think, and that's the other thing, is that you can, again, beat yourself up with your transpersonal principles of how you're supposed to be, what you've counseled everybody through, but then again, you become your own laboratory. You begin to discover
Can it be any other way, really?
And not only that, I think what it is I think it's a process of recognizing that as a therapist or as a healer, what you have to do is you, quote unquote, you heal yourself, but I think as you open up to the world, you find more dimensions of hurt, more dimensions of pain, more dimensions of things that you're closed off to. And so what you try and do is you try and keep on opening, and it becomes your job if you're really sincerely committed to it.
I mean, that's in a way what a human being would want to do, whatever job you had.
One would hope that, and I think, I think what it is that even when we think we're turned away from that, what ends up happening is that love, that loving kindness, that sense of loving nature that I talk about in the book, really is what we're trying to connect to. So in some ways, even when we're blowing it badly, even when we're even when we're disconnecting and we are doing things to numb ourselves out, eventually, I think what ends up happening is the knocks get louder.
It gets more and more traumatic to wake us up.
And in terms of when that happens, again, I mean, we've talked about the fact that I've done a lot of work with death and dying, and it can be on one's deathbed that suddenly the heart opens up and everything gets resolved at the last moment. And sometimes it doesn't, and so it waits for another time to recycle through, to do it again, to work it out.
And you feel, because of the intimacy and the power of the tantric, the sexuality, the intimacy, that relationships are a great grounds for that knowledge to be explored?
I think it is one of the most important areas. It's one thing for someone to talk about benefiting all sentient beings, and you'll look at a lot of religious literature that will in some ways talk about, the poor and the needy, et cetera, et cetera. And then what ends up happening is it's kind of like the cobbler not making shoes for his own children. What ends up happening is that people don't work out those transpersonal, those ultimate views in their relative everyday lives. And to me, that is a real crisis. I think that it happens in the spiritual communities. I think that's the crisis that's been happening in the Western traditions. It's the same thing that's happened in Eastern traditions, where what ends up happening is we sort of like look at the ultimate view views and we look at sort of like meditating in a way that helps somebody over there, but in terms of making it so that you can deal with the fact that your daughter hasn't done her homework for 2 weeks, or the fact that you're having difficulty with your wife in terms of negotiating time schedules and frustration with taxes and things that are going on in her work life and your work life. If you can't translate that in those into intimate situations and all you can do is kind of relativize it to something out there, then I think something is missing. And to me, it was important in my own life to start bringing those spiritual lessons into my own home situation.
I mean, wouldn't you say that at some point you want to bring those into every situation?
Oh, absolutely.
And so, you know, that would be one that is obviously when you deal with so much.
And I think also what, well, at least for me, what becomes important is that until I really begin to live those in my closest relationships, in some respects, everything that I teach anybody else is theoretical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
until
so-
it's real for you.
And so to me, facing my own frustrations, my own embarrassments, the times when I close my heart off because I'm too busy, because I'm creating something very special, or I'm meditating now and I really don't have time for the kids or whatever, because I'm supposed to be benefiting sentient beings. Meanwhile, my kids are banging on the door and I'm not letting them in because I'm benefiting
And isn't
sentient
it always
beings.
like, you know, like a balance, and that's what discernment is?
I think a lot of it is balance. I think it is something which, I think that oftentimes in our Western cultures, what we've done is we've dichotomized between the sacred and the mundane. Even people that are interested in what Eastern traditions that think that they're trying to make it all one, there's still this dichotomy that we've been living out of, this duality. And I think it is a matter of learning how to discern and realizing that the absolute is in the relative is in the absolute. Our everyday situations are just as much our teacher than a teacher that's on the shrine or in heaven or wherever. And so to me, it is a question of having that discernment, recognizing that, and really trying to essentially heal that separation.
And what tools have you found are like the most direct, the most clear, the most vibrant in bringing that reality into being in a human being?
I think there have got to be ways in which we learn tools that help us just to connect with ourselves in the moment. That's why I have a whole section devoted to very, very simple meditations that basically are Buddhists can use, but non-Buddhists can use. Anybody can use them. The purpose of which
You don't have to present a card.
No, you don't have to present a card to do this particular practice exactly.
Good. Thank God.
Really.
Right.
And the idea, though, is what helps you, and it can be a meditation, it can be a kind of prayer, it can be a kind of visualization, but what helps you to dissolve that sense of separation, okay? And I think in many respects, one of the problems we face is that a lot of these things have been relativized. We don't have one homogeneous culture to learn from. Some of the cultures that we are a part of haven't really shared those kind of wisdom aspects of those traditions for generations. And so what happens is people don't look to themselves, don't know how to look inside themselves. And that's, I think, one of the gifts of the Eastern traditions coming to the West, is it's reminding us of even those traditions inside our Western cultures that we need to adopt and begin to work with in order to start connecting to ourselves. And as we begin to do that, I think what happens is our sense of ego, our sense of what we're trying to protect begins to dissolve. So I've used Buddhist techniques, I've used certain forms of meditation that have been very, very helpful in dealing with anger and jealousies and those kinds of things. But to me, in essence, what you're looking at is what does any particular tradition or culture do to instill that sense of self-reflection and contemplation in people, which is very revolutionary in itself.
Except it's been around since time began.
Exactly.
But it is revolutionary.
It's it's revolutionary because what it does is it revolutionizes the mind. They've been around forever, but what happens is that there are times when cultures or societies don't emphasize those things, and I think that what ends up happening is over a period of time, that when they're not emphasized for a long period of time, then we start ending up in situations like we find ourselves in right now.
You mean that kind of muscle starts to atrophy in a sense?
Exactly. It is essentially a muscle that you have to work.
And so what you're saying is that maybe in the 60s when, you and I were kind of coming of age.
Right.
There were a lot of Eastern traditions. There was a lot of different tools being introduced into our world.
Absolutely.
That opened the door again, in a sense, after being kind of closed for a while.
And again, recognizing that oftentimes when traumatic situations are present in the world, it's people want simplistic answers. People aren't necessarily looking for self-reflection. They're looking for ways of just taking care of their survival needs. And I think that's what happens when things get dire, is more fundamentalist type of traditions begin to get stronger, simply because people want answers to the chaos they have to face. And after
Simple answers.
World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and what ends up happening is when you see generation upon generation being fragmented, households being fragmented, people beginning to move away from their extended families, what ends up happening is that we basically get caught in survival. And as we begin to move away from that, then what happens is we begin to finally ask, well, now I'm safe, now I'm secure, who am I? And what am I really trying to connect with? Which, again, your question that you asked in the beginning of the show about how do you connect with that love? Where is that love? How do we connect with our loving nature again? Becomes really what we've always been looking for, but sometimes we're too busy just trying to make sure there's food on the table and we get distracted.
Yeah, it's interesting because, when something is that traumatic, we do reach into this survival mode, but we also, it's like so crazy.
Oh, absolutely.
That it's just, right after the survival mode is like, my God, this place is a nut house.
And absolutely, what's interesting to see is that oftentimes it is in the midst of those situations
exactly.
that those things are found. It's kind of like what's got a front, it's got a back, the bigger the front, the bigger the back. And many teachers have actually said that although these situations that we find ourselves are in very, very dire, and people have a hard time connecting, that when people do connect, their transformation is very, very fast.
Right.
And that's the gift of the time.
It's so big and so traumatic.
That's the gift right now.
Right, and the opportunity.
Yes.
All right, well, I think maybe what we'll do now is we'll go to the second video. This is another video written by Lessia and myself. It's on the Lessia Bridging Heaven and Earth video. It's the CD. It's called Heaven and Earth. Listen to the words. It's really what we're talking about the whole show, and it's I think it's a beautiful song. I really love it. Of course, I wrote it, but I also really love it. Even when I listen to it now, Heaven and Earth, and the slideshow is by Walter Matheson, a good friend of the show.
Mason was the sweetest kid. He knew an awful lot till he grew up and got busy, and then somehow he forgot the stars dancing in his head that connected all inside. His world was more wide open then. He really had it right. He knew the bridge between heaven and earth. He knew the magic of love and all it was worth. Jenny was a happy girl. She found bliss in every way. But then she had a life to run, and there was no more time to play. And though her long-held dreams came true, they didn't fit her well. She kept thinking she'd forgotten something, but she couldn't really tell. She'd lost the bridge between heaven and earth. She'd lost the magic of freedom and all it was worth. Why does our childlike wonders begin to slip away? Why does our open heart close down more every day? Why does our trusting spirit slowly fade to gray? us on the line. We look good on the outside, but we left our joy behind. Well, Mason saw the stars once, and Jenny knew the truth. With the packaging so good out here, we seldom seem to choose to take the bridge between heaven and earth. To feel the magical oneness we all sense at birth, to know the power of love and what it's worth. To take the bridge between heaven and earth. To take the bridge between heaven and earth. Mason was the sweetest kid who knew an awful lot. Jenny was a happy girl, but somehow they forgot.
Well, we're back. So, in a relationship, you've been married like what, 25,
27 years.
27 years. Boy,
Right.
nowadays that's a good stint.
Yes.
So that's great. So, what would you say is like the most difficult area for you? I mean, who's dedicated your life to knowing consciousness, to knowing love?
I think it's a question. I think one of the things is in the everyday mundane realities of taking care of a household, taking care of work. It's so money, taxes, you name it. I think it's a sense of getting disconnected. First, you get disconnected from yourself, and then, as you don't even know how disconnected from your own love you are inside yourself, you begin to expect it from someone else, and that kind of expectations get higher. Miscommunications start increasing. Anger begins to come up. I mean, there's all sorts of negative emotions that arise when we somehow disconnect, and and oftentimes, I mean, it's interesting to think that a lot of Buddhist teachers have said that it's easy to be a monk, it's hard to be a householder. It's more of a challenge because you can be more equanimitous when all you have to do is face, your relationship to your meditation cushion and whether the cook made a good meal today or not. But if it's your wife, if it's your husband, and you see them every day and you can't get away from them, you can't get away from your meditation cell, and it's like you have to resolve things. I think what happens is you have to look at and begin to open up to what negative emotions there are and how to transform those negative emotions, especially anger.
And you would say anger is one of the most defining in a way.
Anger is, according to Buddhist tradition, you have all the different emotions, and anger is considered the most destructive. It says anger destroys virtue. It's like when you really have an angry outburst.
You're out of control.
When you're out of control, what ends up happening is you notice how exhausted you are. You feel like you're depleted of energy. You feel like whatever positive feelings you've been storing up in the positive energy bank have been just like broken out of the bottom and just spilled all over the ground. And oftentimes it can take a long time to recover that good feeling, that kind of positive quality when that finally comes out. It doesn't mean that you sort of deny that it's there. Okay, but there's ways of working with it, and to me, it's important to learn how to work with the energy of what anger offers.
And just simply, how have you learned to work with anger?
Well, I'll give you an example of it. It's in the book. It's a little vignette that I give, where this was very early on when I'd just been learning meditative processes, but I was very intensively involved with them, and I was married, and we had one daughter, and what happened was we were living in England and we were upstairs talking, and we started disagreeing. And as my wife and I were disagreeing, Melanie and I were disagreeing, a bizarre thought went through my head, because you begin to realize that every single negative emotion we have has got a habitual pattern. There's patterns, and there's a whole gestalt around every negative emotion. So what happened was we started getting in this argument. And what happened was, in my mind, I went, we don't argue upstairs, we argue downstairs. And as it was going through my own mind,
It broke the whole tradition.
it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense. It's like,
this is not right.
We argue downstairs. And as I was thinking that, as if my wife habitually knew the pattern, she began to walk down the stairs.
Wow.
And I was following her, and I'm going, I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm actually going to play
So in
this
other
one
words,
out.
your consciousness saw you.
I
You
was-
separated for a moment.
I was able to, in some ways, develop a little bit more detachment from the habitual process, but I still couldn't stop it.
Right, you
That
still
was-
were on your way down the stairs.
I was still on my way down the stairs, and then I positioned myself in the doorway, where I would normally stand when I was getting into this angry, heated argument with my wife. And she stood in the window and would walk back and forth from the window to the fireplace, and she would whisper things or mumble things under her breath, and I would say what, and then she would throw something at me, and I would retort and go back and forth. Until finally we would get to a scene where I would normally look at her, say the worst possible thing I could possibly say with my hand on the door. And then what I would do is I would say it, I would grab the door behind, walk out, slam the door, she would begin to cry, I'd walk around the block, we'd kiss and make up, and then go for round two. And this was pretty much how it went, you know? And I knew in my mind that if I got my hand on the door and I did this, it wasn't going to resolve anything.
You were going to walk around the block twice and the
And
whole pattern would
The whole
continue.
pattern was there, but what happened was we got to the door scene, and my hand was on the door. I was about ready to spew out the worst possible venom I could think of at the moment, and I looked at her, and I turned around, made a full circle, and I looked at her and I said, let's go to dinner. And she went, what? I said, let's go to dinner. And finally what happened was I was able to disrupt the pattern. You know, I could see a hole through it, and I could realize that there was folly in it. It doesn't mean that I learned exclusively at that point never to deal with things with anger. But what it did was it showed me that with spaciousness in our consciousness, even those most difficult, intractable emotions are not solid. Nothing is solid.
And so as you proceeded in your life and your marriage, the more spaciousness that was available within you, the more you brought that to the relationship.
The more I did. And then there are times, I mean, actually what I would say is when I wrote The Passionate Buddha was in a real low point. We had been dealing with a lot of trauma in our families, and I didn't even recognize how much trauma I was experiencing. And I began to write what ended up being my manual for climbing back into my relationship in a positive way. That's what really I was doing. I discovered that afterwards. But for me, what it was I really needed some strong reminders to myself. And so what I really wanted to look at were what are the really most important building blocks in helping a relationship to flourish and to continue. Because what happens is that it's so easy in our environment nowadays where cultures are fragmented to really not realize the value of what it means to stay connected. And so what I really wanted to do was recommit myself to what I'd been learning in my Buddhist practice for all those years, but was recognizing that I was beginning to lose sight of in my own closest relationships in my own family.
Now how, see, I mean, part of what happens, it seems to me, on Earth is that we have, families or countries. I mean, how do we expand into the family of humankind? Because sometimes, the family, the blood family, almost is a barrier, in a sense, because people think their needs are being met in the family, or in the country, or in the religion, and that's part of a separation, that there is the Melanie and Robert family, and then there's the
Right.
Biff and Binny family, and they're not the same
Hopefully
family.
never a Biff and Binny family.
No, there probably is.
There probably is, but we don't want to look for them right now.
No, that would be too
And we apologize to any Biff and Binny family that is out there.
Right.
We don't
for
mean
making fun of them.
Exactly, right. I think what it is really is, as far as I can see, is it's very fascinating. What in some tantric texts talk about is with respect to your family. And when they talk about family, it's really when you get really stuck into the drama of the culture that you're
But
in.
isn't it as much an identification with family?
I think that's what it is, and I think
Okay,
I think what does happen is that when one is stuck in that, then those relationships end up being a way of reinforcing the prison that we find ourselves in. And so they actually talk about your family being like a snake in your own lap, that you have to
Right.
get that snake off your lap
Right.
simply because of the fact that it's just poisonous and it's
Right.
difficult, so you have to step away from that. And in many respects, for some people, they really do need to get away. But at the same time, I really wonder, and this is what I thought was very important, is I really wonder if we are given those tools back into our families, where we're told how to become resourceful unto ourselves and to discover that love inside ourselves, if actually we do have to separate ourselves so much. Because I think what does happen is it can be like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, where we think, well, obviously this culture doesn't work, this relationship doesn't work. Obviously, if I say my mantras right now, and what I'll do is I'll find some other nice, happy chanting mantra girl that will be the same way and will have the same values. In some ways, I think that's in some ways, I've seen so many situations that have broken up in quote-unquote spiritual communities because of that. Mm-hmm. And to me, what's important is to really realize and help people to realize that that connection is possible, but you need tools. You actually need something to work with. You actually need reminders.
But would you say that, and I know you do say, because I've read the book, and I've read all your books, most of them. I haven't read them all exactly, but
not enough time in a day.
No, you're too prolific for my reading skills. But that this intimate relationship, this family relationship, this marriage relationship, is a tool in itself to expand where everyone is your family, and these are the people you live with, and they're the ones you call your family. But there's this universal family.
I think what happens is it's kind of like I remember the show Happy Days, which
Fonzie.
With a Fonzie and the whole family, but there was something that was wholesome and positive and funny and quirky and everything like that that made it so that when you watched that show and you watched kind of like the goofiness of their relationships and how they tried to work out things, even things that were difficult, that it kind of made you smile. And I think what happens in families where there is that kind of love that's radiating from within in each person and radiating out, it does become kind of contagious. In fact, the Dalai Lama made a comment in one of his books on the basis of peace and happiness, that if there's no happiness in the family, there's no happiness in the society. And so, obviously there's a relationship, and there's a symbiotic relationship, but there's got to be a way in which intimacy and working and transforming intimacy into ways of making love radiate in all different directions has got to be something that people are focused in day to day, moment to moment, in the people that are closest to them.
So you said that in the book there were like building blocks, or tools to bring this aspect of a relationship into being, where people are more connected and more.
Right.
Why don't you talk about a few of those?
One of the building blocks I focus on in the beginning of the book is looking at the situation we find ourselves in. We have to actually be able to scan our environment and look at what are the barriers to intimacy. Some of the barriers are not being connected to a tradition that has wisdom and compassion and tools to work and develop those things as part of what we have been raised with. But on top of that, we're in a very unhomogeneous society. So what ends up happening is people have different belief systems, people have broken up their families and moved great distances. So all of the kinds of expectations that we might have had a century ago in terms of not moving more than 10 miles away from our own community and marrying the boy next door and going to the only church that was available in our community, that doesn't exist anymore. And we move around so much. So there are ways in which we have disconnected from what has been the way in which humanity has lived for thousands of years. There's that external experience. Then, so I think people have got to recognize that there are barriers and difficulties and challenges in our society and in our culture. Then what I want to look at is I look at different meditative methods to help us reconnect with ourselves. That's another portion of the book. Another portion of the book is devoted to looking at little sayings that to me are like little viruses that teachers put in your neuroses programs. Little sayings that catch your mind and make you to realize when you are getting caught in your habits rather than connected to your love. And a lot of teachers have those sayings, and I explore those sayings as a way of helping people.
What's your favorite?
First thought, best thought. And the reason why I put it in the beginning is from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And the reason why I bring it out is it doesn't mean that first thought is the absolute most correct thought. But if we second guess ourselves, if we go with something, and let's say I meet someone for the first time, And my initial reaction is, and if let's say if I'm going to meet this person, let's say we meet at a restaurant and we connect, but then I go, this person isn't for me. But then what happens is, and I instinctively feel it, but then I go,
yeah, reason comes in.
But after all,
Right.
this is a person and they have love inside them and they're obviously compassionate and I'm prejudging them and everything like that. And then 3 months later, you make a conclusion that this person isn't for you. Meanwhile, what you've done is you've been second guessing yourself, third guessing yourself, and then you develop resentments and all sorts of problems in this relationship. So to me, there's a way of how do you connect with that initial gut response, if you want.
How do you trust yourself?
How do you trust yourself? And to, in a sense, know when a situation isn't going to work, and at the same time, when you connect with somebody and go, "Wow, that happened too fast." I mean, after all, this person isn't making enough money. They don't look the right part. I have this long list of who they're supposed to be. I tell people, in fact, the longer your list is as to who you think you have to have in your life, the longer you're going to stay lonely.
Right.
It doesn't mean
it's too hard a list to fulfill.
It's too hard a list to fulfill. They have this, but they don't have
Right.
that. So I'm going to just rule that out. So to me, it's like, how do you connect with that? So to me, it's a very powerful statement, which follows into other statements that are from the Zen tradition, like "Do not look for the truth, only cease to cherish opinion." Okay. Because opinion is something that can make it like, I know the truth about this situation, and the other person from their perspective knows the truth about this situation, and then you go to war about the truth, rather than realizing, if I soften up and realize that everything is kind of relative, that maybe I don't see the whole picture, and I just open myself up to the possibility that
you break the edges down a little.
You begin to break the edges down, suddenly what ends up happening is you find out that you can relate to this person more positively. You have more in common with this person than you ever imagined. And to me, those are very important. And then the other area that I really look at are things like, the Buddhist interpretation on sexuality, on abortion, on contraception, all the kinds of things which do get into our face, into our relationships when we are wanting to get intimate with someone, and suddenly you start going into the issues around contraception. What do you think about contraception? What forms of contraception? What are your attitudes about what if you conceive a child? What is your attitude about abortion or not abortion or adoption? Those are kind of issues that are moral issues that need to be looked at from a very rational point of view. And what I really encourage people to do is to include those difficult areas as conversations.
As a first date. All on your first date.
All on your first date. Just get it over with.
Right. What do you think about abortion?
That's right.
Contraception?
That's right. Just check them off.
We'd like one cocktail.
Really. This will be an all-nighter.
This is going to be. How long do you have, dear?
I think what's interesting is that those weren't necessarily the questions that Melanie asked me when we first met. But what is fascinating to know is that a lot of
she asks them every day now.
No. Yeah.
What do you think about?
What do you think about these things now?
You were born again this morning.
Right.
Yeah.
But what happened was, in the beginning of our relationship, it really was that there were a lot of questions, just philosophical questions about all sorts of things that she just wanted to have questions. We dialogued a lot, and that was very, very important to go through that process, looking at those more nitty-gritty issues, especially if you've been in and out of relationships in the past, and it ends up being that those kinds of issues just bite you in the end again and again and again, simply because you're not willing to trust and open up and bring those things out and be vulnerable to the moment. And in that vulnerability, there's a tremendous way in which barriers can be broken. The idea, I think there's one saying that truth is a great aphrodisiac.
Now you're talking. We had some people who went to the ayahuasca people. They said that was pretty good too.
Oh, yes, okay.
Truth, but
that's right. Well, you can do it
go
that
a
way.
lot of ways.
You can go in various ways.
Right. So, do you find that? Obviously, people have issues and difficulties, problems in relationships. Obviously, the divorce rate in the United States is 50%. So you know that's something.
Sure.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think in this society that it's important that people actually get married? Or loving is fine. How do you feel about the institution of marriage?
I think if we look at what the initial idea was behind it. I mean, if we start looking at how people make a commitment and how people make that commitment as a pronouncement into society, it's very, very powerful. Whether you do it in a church, whether you do it on a hillside or whatever, there's got to be some kind of ritual that a couple finds relevant. And what's happened over centuries, as cultures have created these things. To me, I've done various marriages for people, to help them to be married, and then they go to the registrar and then sign up. But what I look at is, how do you personalize that experience? Otherwise, if all you're looking at is at it being a formality and the family's got to do this to make it look right, I think that's where the problem lies. And I think also what it is that there's no the culture that would look at what the meaning of marriage was and what the connection is about, the contemplation as to what this is going to mean on an ongoing basis. This is challenged in various ways. I think to some extent, if you think about it realistically, if we look at the whole 20th century and we look at how many families were fragmented from warfare and how many mothers became single parents, and then we look at the idea therefore of where is the trust in the ongoingness of relationship, and then when you start having it where you no longer get to watch your own parents go through their old age because you're living on the other side of the country, so you don't get to really know what
not on a day-to-day basis.
Not on a day-to-day basis. And to me, that day-to-day basis is very important. And I think as we step away from warfare and more towards peace, and we get to stay around each other a little bit longer and our lives get longer, we really have to look at these things and really develop the insights to transform what has become a very dysfunctional institution, for sure.
I think we're coming to the end of the show. How we managed
How have we
to
done
do
that?
it in an hour is incredible. It really is incredible. So, again, it's the same question. The same question. Good night. Do you know the love? Good night. God bless you.